Dr. Jamie Madigan, welcome.
Thanks for having me on. Always down to talk shop about psychology and video games.
The video game industry is worth an estimated $189 billion, and that is more than TVs, movies, and music combined. What is it about video games that makes it surpass all those other mediums?
Wow, starting off with the easy questions. Love it. Let's let's smooth into it. Yeah, I mean it's been true for a while that video games are huge business, and I've sort of gotten to see their rise and how popular they've become. And I think one of the reasons why as popular as they are, there's probably a few reasons. One of the big ones is that they are an interactive way to experience media. So, whenever you're playing games, it's an interaction between the player and whoever made the game, like the game designers. Like they're sort of setting the rules and the game players are deciding how to behave within those rules. And that sort of interactivity doesn't exist in really any other kind of media like that. I mean, I guess you could say like board games, tabletop role playing games, and so forth. There are other places, but I call those games as well. And it just sort of gives players an opportunity to experience things that they don't get out of other media. And then the other big reason why I think they're as popular as they are is that it gives game developers the opportunity to craft experiences that are maximally engaging, right? So that people are going to be interested in doing them, and they're going to give them feedback about how they're doing and what they're doing and whether it's working. They'll be able to connect them to other people. So, players have like this whole range of things that they look for when they want to play games or have an experience. And depending on what kind of game you're making, you can deliver custom, almost sometimes experiences, or very tailored types of experiences to people that check off a lot of those, psychological checkboxes for things that people find meaningful and things that they're looking for. And games allow, things like immediate feedback. They allow goal setting for players to, allow them to have engagement and participation in setting their own goals and to participate. So, and I think the short answer is that unlike other kinds of media, video games can be engineered to be engaging in ways that other types of media can't.
In your mind, what it makes for the anatomy of a good video game? What draws players in? What keeps them playing? And then what facilitates them to create like social networks around these games?
Yeah, I mean that's a couple of different questions, and I think the question of like what makes a good video game, there's no one answer to that, right? Like there's lots and lots of different kinds of games and lots of different kinds of experiences, and some people love some and not others. I don't play every type of game. I don't play every genre of game. But the ones that I do play are there. So there's been some research and some academics who have kind of looked at like gaming motivations, like what types of things motivate players to play games, and then how do different genres or different mechanics of games, satisfy those needs or those desires. And one of my favorite models along those lines was done by some guys at a company called Quantic Foundry, which you can find by searching for that. And they have like this whole gaming motivation model where they're like, okay, some people are looking for action in games. Some people are looking for social connection. Some people are looking for developing their skills. Some people are looking for narratives and like immersion into worlds. And some people are looking for ways to express creativity. And those can sort of fit into like different genres of games or different mechanics of games. And despite what genre you're in, or if you have a blend of genres. So I think, the answer to the question of like what makes for an engaging game depends on the player and depends on what the game delivers broadly. But there are like characteristics of successful games in the way that they use psychology that I have noticed and I come across and that I've occasionally seen people study in a rigorous academic way. And they have to do with things like providing effective feedback for players, doing good onboarding and on ramping for players, for the kind of games that offer that sort of stuff, effectively managing social relationships between players and giving players social information about themselves and other players so they can do things like compare themselves to other players and sort of know how they're doing by doing those social comparisons. Um, Setting appropriate challenges. I think that goes with like goal setting and feedback, the way they do things. Things like random reward schedules are super effective in like everything when it comes to human psychology. But video games that sort of let you identify a goal, pursue it, get the hit from you know opening a treasure chest or defeating an elite boss and seeing what your reward is, and then you sort of repeat the cycle over and over again. Like games that do that really well tend to be more successful, I think, than others. And then there's a ton of other variables that have nothing to do with psychology, just like how well made is the game, how good is the marketing, how is it what the market is looking for right now, and all those sort of things that you'd have to probably talk to an actual game designer or a marketing person to understand. But as far as the psychology stuff, that's what I've seen.
You're a psychologist by trade, but you are very much into video games. So, how did you come to play video games? What spurred that? And then, how did you get your start studying psychology?
Yeah, so video games came first because I am a lifelong gamer. I'm actually might kind of date myself, but I'm of the generation that grew up with coin operated arcades. Mhm. So, as a kid, I there were a couple of arcades in within walking distance of my house, and that's where I spent my days and my quarters uh, playing all those kinds of games. And then it was just a habit that I never really dropped. I kept, playing different kinds of games into high school, and I started getting into computer games and console games like the NES and Sega. And actually, I never owned a Sega. I had a friend that did, but doing that, and then eventually, up to the evolution of more modern video games through the late 1990s and early 2000s when you had online, starting to be more of a thing with competitive shooters and games, and then massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft and so forth. So it's just like it's something I enjoyed. It's something I kept doing and kept make part of my life. And I eventually also became interested in psychology when I was an undergraduate and decided to go to graduate school for that and get a degree, PhD in what's called industrial organizational psychology, which, if you're not familiar with that sort of corner of the field, it's applying psychology to the workplace, to understanding behaviors in the workplace. My sort of pithiest definition of it is, IO psychologists try to make work suck less. So we try to improve the lives of employees and employers and do things like, make sure that there's a good match between a person and a job. And how do we most effectively train people? How do you most effectively lead people? How do you organize departments and teams and all of that sort of stuff? So it covers a lot of things. And went to work in that field and was doing, back in like 2008, 2009, was doing a lot of reading on like behavioral economics, which is we used to call the psychology of decision making, and these other kind of psychology books, and thinking back on all the stuff that I had studied in graduate school and undergrad even about psychology in general, and thinking like, this kind of explains why games are designed the way that they are a lot of times. And it also kind of explains why games are marketed and sold how they are. And it kind of explains, at least to some extent, why people behave as they do when they play games. So I kind of started looking into other things like media psychology and communications and all these other types of topics. And I was like, somebody should like really write about this. And then I decided I was somebody. And so I created psychologygames.com back in like late 2009. Gosh, it's been a while. I've been doing this for a while. And started writing blog posts about it. So this was back in the day before YouTube was as big as it is, and before social media was as big as it is, and that sort of stuff. So I did it on the website, and it quickly attracted an audience, not only gamers and players, but like game people in the business, like game developers, who were interested in sort of how I was applying psychology to game design and marketing and player behavior. And then I decided, I'd written enough about this, I could probably write a book. And so I wrote the first book, Getting Gamers, got that published, and then ended up writing the second book, and then the most recent book about psychology of Dungeons and Dragons, and here we are today. Just sort of something that I enjoyed so much, I kept it going.
Yeah, the psychology of video games, it seems like it was kind of a natural marrying of the two topics in your life. Do you think that video games are kind of like the perfect laboratory to observe human psychology?
They're a really good one, yeah. And again, like there's such a variety of video games that statement can mean a lot of different things, but frequently, yeah, if you're wanting to look at like how basic psychological theories can apply in a practical setting, video game will give you an opportunity to do that. Like you can look at, and that was one of the things I realized very early on is like all this very basic kind of psychological theory could be applied to player behavior, to gamer behavior. So if you want to look at basic things like goal setting and social comparisons and um, feedback and training and learning and like all these sort of things, like you can see how people do those things in the context of video games because that is what games do and it's how they engage players a lot of times. And so it's a very natural fit for not only how do you understand these psychological concepts, but then like how do you apply them to making better games, with better being, depending on what your goals are, but and in a lot of cases. And that's why I think that so many of the game developers latched on and were interested in what I was saying and why I was able to get, so many people to come on the podcast and talk about this stuff as well.
So let's talk a little bit about those developers. Do they build these games with psychology in mind, or do they kind of build the structure of the game and happen onto psychological tendencies on accident?
So no and yes, I would say. So one of the things I notice is in talking with game developers, and I had worked sort of adjacent to the video game industry for a while before I did this in like the early 2000s. So I knew people who were developers and people who then went on to become developers. So they would often come on to these same sorts of ideas and metrics and applications through not applying the psychology terms or not coming at it from that angle, but just sort of like iterating and paying attention to what worked. So they know that if we create like a core gameplay loop in this particular way, then it keeps players engaged and it keeps them, wanting to play. And they noticed that if we offered feedback in this particular way, then players reported being happier or they, changed undesirable behaviors, like standing in lava or, that sort of stuff when they're playing the game. And so I think a lot of them do come on to these psychological principles just because they're smart people who are iterating and paying attention. But there are also psychologists working in the game industry that pay attention to this sort of stuff and apply psychology. User interface and user experience is sort of like the biggest area where you'll find psychologists applying their trade, and they often specialize in UI UX. So they'll be looking at like, well, they'll be using like cognitive psychology to understand like how do people take in information, how do they process it, what's the optimal way to present, a heads up display or quest information, or social information or any of those kinds of things. So you have people applying their trade there. And then you also have people with psychology backgrounds or who are otherwise digging into it just at the game design level, trying to apply that sort of stuff. It's not super common, like, and it's probably not as central to the job as like good game design skills, and things like art and coding and sound design and all of those sort of bread and butter types of things. But I do think you get, especially in larger organizations and larger teams, more and more psychologists helping.
You kind of highlighted there's few different areas that these game designers are tapping into. And the first one I wanted to discuss a little bit is goal setting. So, how do video game designers use goal setting to maximize player engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a lot of different types of takes on goal setting and different ways in which goals are applied in video games. Um, and if you think about it, goals show up constantly in video games. Every quest log is a list of goals, right? So if you're playing like an RPG or any other kind of game where it's like you have objectives or quests and subquests, then those are goals. And there's some things that games do to sort of highlight those and make you more likely to want to complete those goals. Like, for example, I've written about what's called the Zeigarnik effect, which is where we're more likely to pay attention to and ultimately complete goals if we think we've already started them. So if we feel like they're incomplete but begun. And this is something that's an idea that's been around psychology for decades and decades. And I think it shows up in video games because they'll often like put something into your quest log or your list of objectives that like you've already started or completed one of 6 steps. So if you're playing an MMO and you need to collect, 10 gore tusk livers to take the classic example, then that quest may start up when you collect your first one. So it'll say like 1 of 9. And so you're like, wow, I need 9 more. I might as well like go out there and find them. And there's been research to show, not specifically in video games, but in other contexts, like consumerism with those like customer loyalty cards. You have like a punch card where you buy 6 sandwiches and you get one free or whatever, or you get so many car washes and you get one free. Most of that stuff has been replaced by like apps these days, but same principle applies. And they've done research to show that like if you give somebody a loyalty card and you punch the first 1 or 2 punches, then they're more likely to come back and spend money to get car washes to try to get their next one than if you give them the same punch card but don't give them any starter punches. And so I think like you see that show up in video games and quest logs and objectives a lot of times. And you can definitely do that and design that into your UI or your quest system and so forth. Um, Other ways that goal setting shows up, sort of a similar concept. You can have sets, and the closer you are to completing a set of something, the more likely you are to want to pursue completing the whole thing. So if you have okay, you need to do this 10 times versus you need to do this 5 times. And even if it requires the same amount of effort, like people are more likely to follow through on the goal if it's doing something 5 times instead of 10 times, even if it's like the same number of minutes or hours involved. So phrasing things like that, and it's just kind of amazing, like the difference that phrasing makes in these sorts of things. And you can threaten to like take away rewards, and that's much more motivating than threatening to give players rewards of equal value. It's called loss aversion. It's a very robust psychological phenomenon, and you see that applied in video games sometimes as well, in the way that just simply the way that things are phrased. You can talk about early days of World of Warcraft. They used to have like an XP penalty system because they didn't want players to keep playing the game for extremely long periods of time. I guess that was back when they cared more about that sort of thing. So they instituted like a 10% experience point gain penalty. I think it was about 10%. Don't quote me on that. And they found that players hated it. So what they did is they switched it to a 10% bonus on XP gain when you were under that threshold, and people loved it. They're like, "Ooh, bonus! You're giving me something instead of taking it away," and I react to that much more effectively. That example's not really goal setting, but I sort of went there anyway.
Well, but it's feedback, right? And that's another thing that you touch back on is that the games are constantly they're setting goals, but also providing you feedback and how you're doing or how you're moving along those lines. So how do they use feedback loops to keep you engaged along partnered with that goal setting routine?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to your original question, right? Of like, why are video games so popular? And I think I mentioned it there, but they're much better at giving immediate, accurate feedback that's tied to your behaviors than you get just about anywhere else. I wrote about this in the engagement game book about why if you're trying to give your employees feedback, you should look at what video games do. I mean, it's because video games give players feedback immediately, so it's unambiguous about what behavior the feedback is tied to, or it is ideally. They give it specifics, and they usually quantify it, and they give it repeatedly. And compare that with something like those of us who've worked in corporate America, where you may get like your performance review from your manager, and you get that, what, once a year, twice a year if you're lucky, every 6 months. And a lot of times, especially if your manager is not very good at their job, it's just sort of like, yeah, you're doing great. I don't, you're doing fine. 4.5 out of 5, no notes. And that's not useful, right? If you're trying to like actually improve your performance or anything along those lines, or figure out how you could do things better. But video games, on the other hand, give feedback consistently, frequently, unambiguously, and it's tied to your specific behaviors. And kind of going back on the goal setting piece, one other sort of interesting thing that I realized when I was looking at video games and goals is that the conventional wisdom is that you want to set specific, difficult goals for people, right? And that'll improve their performance. That's sort of the wisdom. And that's true in a lot of cases. Like we have research going back to the 1960s showing that that's the case. But a lot of subsequent research has shown that that's only sometimes the case. And when you have situations where like learning and coming up with multiple solutions and sort of really understanding the problem or the system that's involved, when that's the goal, that just saying, hey, do your best, or hey, come up with as many different solutions as you can, then that is way more effective at improving people's performance, because what they do is they start to experiment and they'll try like, well, what if I did it this way? Or what if I tweaked this and did it this way, as opposed to just sort of picking one thing and zeroing in on it to try to maximize performance. They'll get creative and they'll get experimental, and they'll try a lot of different things, and they'll stick with what ends up working the best. And that's as opposed to giving them like a very specific goal. And video games do that all the time, probably more than we realize, because you think about all the types of games that require like, okay, to win this boss battle, you have to come in with like a specific character build. You need like these resistances, you need a weapon that does this kind of damage, and then you need to attack at a distance during the first phase, and then you need to attack close up in the second phase, and then you need to kill the ads here. And so that requires not only like beating the boss and getting good, but it requires like experimentation, or looking it up in a guide these days, but like trying different things and doing different things. And video games reward that sort of experimentation and creativity. And that is sort of a basic fundamental psychological need, is to be able to try different things and to have the autonomy to be able to do that and pursue your goals in ways that are effective, but also comfortable for you, and that sort of reward your own effort and experimentation and choice.
One of the things I was kind of thinking about too from your book was just the timing of it, right? So if I have a corporate job, maybe my project runs 2 to 3 months or something along those, I can't iterate on top of it consistently to maybe do those mini experimentations or improvements. But if I'm playing a video game, right, the match ends, I get my statistics, my feedback. Now I can iterate an improvement on it almost immediately. Whereas, that time in between iterations is a problem in corporate America.
It can be, yeah. And you can sort of break it down and talk about specific steps you're taking during your day-to-day work, but not always. And sometimes things are evaluated at the project level that, like you said, can span weeks or months or even years in some cases. And that's true. Like you can't always directly transplant the way video games do things to the world of work or anything else, but you can still take notes and think about it. And at the end of the day, it's still the reason why video games people would rather play video games a lot of times than work, as I'm sure most people have at least at one point or another had that thought.
One of the other things you touched on was mastery or a growth mindset. How do video games structure that mastery growth mindset mentality for players?
Yeah, so mastery or feeling like you're getting better, or more competent at something, is another one of those fundamental like psychological needs that motivates us to do anything that we do voluntarily, such as play video games. And there's been some research to show that you can think of two broad mindsets that people have whenever they try to do a challenging task. And one is like a growth mindset, and one is a fixed mindset. And the fixed mindset says you either have the skills to do this or have the capacity to do this, or you don't. And if you fail at something, then you're meant to fail at it, and there's no point in really trying that much harder. And then you have growth mindsets where you see challenges and failures more as like an opportunity to get feedback and to develop and learn and improve. And those things exist on a spectrum. So not everybody is 100%, on either end of the spectrum. And you can have different mindsets for different types of tasks, right? So I'm not trying to say like this explains everything, but what video games are good at is encouraging that growth mindset to where if you try something or if you fail, the video game gives you feedback and it gives you ideas and it gives you options for trying something else. So, like, go into the encounter with a different build, try a different strategy, go grind out some levels, upgrade your gear, do whatever you need to do. And critically, like, the video game gives you the opportunity to do that, right? Like, it gives you tools and resources to do those sorts of things. Well designed games do. Um, and then there's like a whole separate conversation, I guess, to be had about the masocore types of games, which are practically impossible for most mere humans. But those are exceptions, and in most cases, popular accessible video games will allow you to, or they will reward a growth mindset and a sense of like growing mastery and competence in something.
So one of the other things you talked about in your book was the sense of immersion that designers build. So they're building goals, they're feedback loops, they're giving you mastery, but to get you really immersed into the game, they have to design an environment that allows you to interact and really build, think you're really in the game. Why is that critical for that like final connection point for a quality game?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the only way you can have a quality game. Like, match three puzzle games don't immerse you in an imaginary world, but a lot of games, that is something on the bullet point for their marketing, and it's like one of the design goals for the game is they want to make you feel like you are immersed in the world. And when psychologists study this sort of stuff, and a lot of like media psychologists do in particular, they call it spatial presence or social presence if the emphasis is on feeling like you're present with another person. Because psychologists like to be difficult and we like to have our own special little terms for everything. But in practice, like what most other people talk about immersion, they're talking about the same thing: social or spatial presence. And spatial presence is when you sort of forget about the technology that's between you and the imaginary world. So you lose focus on the screen, the controller, the keyboard, the VR headset, whatever it is, and you sort of adopt this primary reference point of like, where am I as the imaginary world that's being created for you or that you're co-creating. And there's like a number of different factors that make that easier or harder to do for people. Some people are just more naturally able to like suspend their disbelief and feel spatially present. So there's like an individual difference component, but there's certain things about like the technology that's used that if the fidelity of the graphics, if it's got really great graphics and if they do things like capture movement correctly, and if it's got great 3D sound design, and if the controllers that you're using feel like they're mimicking things you would do if you were trying to do the on-screen thing, like swing a tennis racket or swing a sword or anything like that. And if the controller, and maybe more importantly, if the controllers like don't get in your way, like if they feel like they're not doing what you want them to do, then that can pull you out of it. And other things like a really rich narrative can also help people feel immersed in a game because they're sort of tying up cognitive resources to process that narrative and think about relationships, and like in general, tying up cognitive resources can make people feel more immersed because they have fewer cognitive resources to think about how they're not immersed, or fewer cognitive resources to think about the fact that they're sitting in front of a monitor or holding a controller or what have you. And the more that a player can sort of fill in the blanks in like the imaginary world with their own knowledge can help as well. So if you know a lot about fantasy tropes, or if you know a lot about westerns, then if when you're playing like Red Dead Redemption 2, you may find it easier to become more immersed because you sort of, even if the game isn't telling you that like, oh, you should be hearing the sound of, cicadas in the background, then like you sort of fill that in yourself maybe and imagine that you are, because you are so familiar with those kinds of settings, those kinds of conventions and so forth, then that you're able to do that, and it helps with that feeling of immersion. And there's research to show that when people do feel immersed in media, not just video games, but television, movies, even books, right? We can get a sense of immersion. That when they do feel immersed, that they tend to report liking the game more. They tend to play the game for longer stretches, or consume the media for longer stretches, and yeah, they enjoy it more, which is usually the end goal. You want players to enjoy playing the game, or people watching your movie enjoy watching it. So it's a very worthwhile goal. My read on the research is that the technology involved kind of plays the biggest part in immersion. So if you can fool people's brains at like the same fundamental level that reality sort of they perceive reality, then you can really get them immersed. And that's where technologies like virtual reality can be so effective into immersing people into environments, is because it's operating in the same way that your normal perceptions operate. So when you turn your head, the scene changes as you would expect it to. You're getting audio feedback, the same way that you would expect to, and all of those sorts of things. But it's not limited to VR. I think VR is just particularly good at creating immersion, which I don't think is a controversial statement. I think most people who have, play those kind of games might agree. They don't necessarily make the best games, but they're pretty immersive.
I was thinking, with immersion, is it the same fundamental attributes of why people like theme parks, right? So if, my wife's walking around Disneyland, she feels like she's in the Tangle world, or is maybe something I felt like walking through the Galaxy Edge of the Star Wars universe here. It's like, okay, there's this spatial awareness. Now, remove all the trash cans, remove all the extra people, remove the tchotchkes. That's what a good video game does, is it kind of puts you in that scenario and then gives you goals, feedback, and then tasks of mastery to accomplish. And that's the framework of a good video game.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And, if you're in, that gets bumped up even more if you're in Galaxy's Edge and you do what is it? I forget what it's called, but the ride where you're like supposedly sitting in a shuttle pod and you're kind of going through the Death Star, and you're surrounded by screens that are recreating this very real environment, and the whole thing you're sitting on like moves when you swoop and swerve, and they'll blast cold air at you at certain scenes, when Kylo Ren or whoever like turns and uses the Force on you. That's definitely the same stuff going on. But I think you're right. Even just in going through those kind of theme park environments, they're trying to present the same experiences that you would have as if you were actually there. And you kind of get pulled out of it when, somebody comes up and wants to sell you a Diet Coke, or, like you said, a trash can, walk into it. And so they'll do things to try to disguise those and make them feel in world as well.
Now, let's talk a little bit about gamers and what kind of games they actually pick. Is it that we're kind of naturally drawn to our personalities? If you're somebody who's very competitive, you're going to pick like first person shooter games, maybe sports games. Maybe if you're somebody more open, more social minded, you might do a more open world. You might be playing Animal Crossing. Do we just kind of naturally select what kind of fits with our personalities?
The term personality means something very specific in psychology. So it's, we talk about measuring people's personalities, and personality is sort of this like ways in which you repeat or are consistent across situations. And there's lots of different models of personalities, like the big five one, where you talk about extroversion and emotional stability and agreeableness and those kinds of things are out there. And if that is what you're talking about in terms of personality, then I don't think it really connects that much to what kinds of games we play. There's been some research out there, but I'll sometimes get requests to say like, "Hey, can you talk about what our personality says about which Mario Kart character we choose?" And it's like, no, not really. There's there's nothing there. You're gonna choose the cart that plays the way you want it to play, or you're gonna choose the one because you really like Diddy Kong or whatever it is. But what you were just describing, I think, sounds more like those gaming motivation needs that we were talking about earlier. So yes, there are certain types of games that allow you to express yourself creatively, right? So you can customize your avatar, you can build things, think like Roblox or not Roblox, Minecraft. You can do all sorts of great expression in those games, and they give you the tools and the creativity and the freedom to do that. Or you may really be interested in getting to the top of a leaderboard and being competitive and winning. You're not going to get that so much from Minecraft or The Sims. You're going to get it from something like Fortnite, or Call of Duty, or something like that. And you may be interested in like a really in-depth narrative. So maybe you would play the most recent God of War games, for example, like single player types of games that really focus on that, in addition to some other stuff like mastery of the combat skills and exploration and so forth. I think very few games are like one note in that way, but there are combinations of those motivators that they'll focus on more than others. So yeah, and sort of like being aware of what you like can be useful. So you can sort of pay attention, like, do I want to play like a collaborative type of game, or do I want to play something that has a ton of story behind it, or do I want to play something that requires me to like understand systems at play, to like really understand like a real-time strategy game or a turn-based strategy game, that like how do all of these pieces interlock and sort of like master that. Feels very different from playing something like Hollow Knight, Silksong, where you have to master physical button presses in order to proceed through the game. So that's a great thing about video games. It's one of the reasons why I've stuck with it my whole life so far, and plan to die with a controller or a keyboard in my hand, is that they do offer like so many different types of experiences, and the market is set up so that they can appeal to so many different types of players. And you may move between those motivations too. Like sometimes you may feel like this kind of game, and other times you feel like that kind of game. Maybe you change over your lifetime. I'm not really aware of any research that's looked at that, but it would be an interesting study to see like how do people change. Like, yeah, when I was 14, I used to love dominating in online shooters, but now that I'm older, maybe I prefer something that's more social because I don't have the reflexes I had when I was 14, or the time to sit and play for like 12 hours on a Saturday, right?
Yeah, I think that's they call them dad gamers now, is when they play Battlefield and they're talking about how sweaty the competitors are. They just say you're a dad gamer now, which strikes at the heart a little bit for me.
Yeah, no, I grew up. I mean, I raised two kids, and one of them, well, at certain points, they both played games, and I would watch like my young daughter playing, um, oh gosh, what is it, Valorant, which is a competitive online shooter, Twitch-based shooter, and she was really good, and she was better than I could be at that point in my life. So there's something to it, and like she had friends that she played with, and she sat and would play for as long as I would let her as well.
Yeah, I mean that kind of actually dovetails to another topic, which is nostalgia here. Um, Last week, actually, Nintendo released Fire Red and Leaf Green for the Switch. So I'm a millennial. That's like my entire generation. That's the games we kind of grew up on. So there was everything across social media was this mad dash to download that and kind of relive some of those old games, but also the nostalgia element of every new iteration of games. They kind of include their predecessors, at least a little bit of a fan service. What is it about gamers that they like this nostalgia aspect to video games, especially if they've played over long periods, maybe even decades of time?
So I mean, it's not just video games. Like people have been using nostalgia to sell us soap and food and movies and all that sort of stuff, but I think video games are, like they are in other areas, uniquely qualified to sort of deliver that nostalgia hit. So nostalgia is something that psychologists have studied a lot. It's an emotion that's sort of like a bittersweet, reminiscing about the past of like when things used to be better, like back in my day. And that's not limited to the olds. It's you see like children experiencing nostalgia for things that happened 3 years ago, for example. But it's this sort of the interesting thing about it is it's this sort of experience where social connections are central to nostalgia. So when you ask people to reminisce about memories like that they're nostalgic about, so think about like, oh, it's like something from your childhood that you're really nostalgic about. A lot of times people will talk about things in the context of social relationships. So it's like a family vacation that I took, or it's the times that I spent with my friends, like sitting down and playing Super Mario Brothers or whatever. It's the time that my sister and I, went to the mall or whatever, played in this game. So other like we tend to be the central characters in our nostalgic memories, which is not surprising, but usually we have a big supporting cast of other people around us. And I think video games are the way that they have become increasingly social over the years means that they're the perfect vehicles for nostalgia, right? So I mean, the first like the big boom in cooperative and multiplayer and social games kind of coincided with the rise of the internet and that kind of technology that allowed people to connect and play games online with each other. But going even further back, you always had like passing the controller or coach co-op types of experiences. And then even if you didn't, you would like talk to other kids on the playground or people at school or your friends about the gaming experiences you were having. But increasingly, games are social, either because they're multiplayer experiences or because we now have tools to sort of connect us to having those experiences. So even if you're playing a single player game, like the old Pokemon games, you can talk to other people and share your experiences and compare notes and do all those kinds of things. Um, so there's that. I think because nostalgia has such a social component to it, and so do video games, that they're going to sell a lot of arthritis cream in the future. With people being marketed to using the Legend of Zelda or Quake or whatever it is, then that's fine. That's great. And because nostalgia tends to like make us happier on balance, and it can be used as like a coping mechanism to deal with things like stress or loneliness or those kinds of things. It's a very useful emotion in that regard. Um, there's also pretty consistent findings that the thing like we're nostalgic about things from a certain age, and it tends to be like late adolescence to early adulthood, right? So teenage years to early adulthood. What's the best music? Well, it was what was playing when you were in high school and college. What's your favorite movies? What's the ones that you saw in that age period? Those kinds of things, which may explain why those re-releases of Pokemon games feel so nostalgic for you because they were probably the ones you played a lot of during that time at some point. And there's some research that's interesting that shows that like that can vary by type of media. Like music may be when you're a little bit older, but like television and movies may be when you're a little bit younger. And I'm not sure about video games. I haven't actually read any research just to learn like what is the sweet spot, what's the key sort of age range for people when it comes to video games. And maybe that doesn't make sense because video games have developed so much more quickly in our lifetimes than relative to something like television or music, or comics or anything like that. That maybe that doesn't even make sense to ask that question.
So you touched on it with the social dynamics. I'd say video games are the most social they've ever been. You have things like Twitch and Discord and Reddit, and just even the games themselves are extremely social. If Why is connection so important to gaming communities here kind of pop up. It's not just you play the game, it's you talk about the game, it's you talk about abilities, or this is the new version, or they need to patch this. What about that social connection that video games foster?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different angles to thinking about that. One is feeling important to other people is another one of those basic psychological needs that video games are good at satisfying. So when you play, say, a competitive game, you are important to your teammates because you're either helping them or not. And important can be I'm important in a good way, or I'm letting people down, but you're important in either case. And you're important also to your opponents because you're the ones that they're competing with, and you're the ones that are maybe keeping them from winning. So all of those types of things in video games make you feel important. When you're showing off your creations to other people, you're relevant to them. When you're cooperating with other people, you're relevant to them. And then there's even some research to show that we can satisfy that need even through fictional people. So the NPC quest givers in a video game, in a role playing game, you can feel important to them. Like you saved the blacksmith's son, or you saved the kingdom. I don't think that is as acute as when you're talking about real people, especially people that you know or that you care about how they see you. But it can happen. So that's why the social aspect of games is frequently so important. And then the other thing you're asking about, I think it's just as simple as like finding your people, finding your tribe, right? So these are people who share your interests. These are people who you are not worried about, coming across as dorky or overly, interested in a particular topic, because they are that way too. And the internet and related technology has made it easier than ever to find those people and connect to them, right? There's Discord servers out there, there's Reddit, there's Twitch, there's all these places where you can go where, like, I'm interested in this particular game or this particular kind of game, and I can just go there and there's like a prepackaged audience for those kinds of things. And then maybe we can break out into subgroups from there. So like I can find people that I want to play with, or I can find people who are interested in some sub aspect of the game, particular builds for a particular kind of class, or speed running, or whatever it is that your sub interest happens to be. You can usually find a way to slice that off and find other people. And it's relatively risk free, right? Like it's very low bar to enter these online communities. You don't risk much reputation because you're usually just a name on a screen, at least at the beginning. And if you find that you don't like these weirdos, or you're the wrong type of weirdo, and you prefer a different kind of weirdo who's more like you, then it's very low cost to like leave those communities too. Like there's no social capital at play, or very little of it. So it's great to be able to experiment and pick and choose and explore, and in ways you just couldn't do before, not conveniently.
So to tie up, like, our two last questions were about social dynamics and nostalgia. Um, there's some negative aspects to the video game world. I grew up in the 2000s, and actually, me and my buddies were kind of talking about this and reminiscing a nostalgic time of how awful and toxic Modern Warfare 2 Xbox Live lobbies were. We didn't partake in it. We were just joking about, like, the things you'd hear is just like you could never do that today, and a lot of that cleaned up. But what about the video game world, or just using the digital space, creates some negative personality or psychological impacts?
Yeah, that stuff happens, unfortunately. And I think that there's some things about the quality or the nature of gaming that leads to it more. I wrote in Getting Gamers extensively, for example, about like online anonymity and de-individuation, which is where when you go into a space and it's set up such and you experience it such that you feel less like an individual and more like a part of a group or part of a crowd. That's what psychologists call like de-individuation. And there's things that can make that more or less likely to happen. So being faceless, being having just like a number or a gamer tag or something like that as sort of like your outward facing identity can make you feel like other people are not seeing you, they're just seeing like you as part of a crowd, and then sort of not even seeing yourself behaving the way you do because you're mixed in with the flow of text messages, or you're being expressed as like an avatar that looks nothing like you. So like not being able to see yourself can sort of stop a lot of the self moderation, can stop sort of the inhibition effects that you might feel with that. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not necessarily a bad thing, or it doesn't always lead to bad behavior, what we would call like toxic behavior, for example. Because when you're in a state of de-individuation, usually what you do is you look to the crowd or cues from the environment on how to behave. So I'm less focused on like my own internal governance on like how I should behave or how I normally behave. And I'm starting to look at like suggestions or cues from the environment from people around me as part of that environment for how I should behave. So which is why you get toxic behavior that can snowball, because if like a few people are being really toxic, you're sitting here and you're like, I'm not sure how to behave in this situation. Oh, I guess it's okay to make those kinds of jokes, or I guess it's okay to use those kinds of terms, or behave in this way. And so you may be more likely to do it. That can work in other directions too. Like, so if you get into a group and you feel de-individuated and you see people around you being helpful and cooperative and like kind, or like ribbing each other in like a friendly way that's clearly not toxic, then that can then signal to you like, oh, that's what's expected of me in this group. That's how people behave in this weird situation I find myself in. And so I'm more likely to behave in that way. And there's a little bit of research suggesting that you can pick up on cues like that just from the themes of the experience. So if you're playing like a war themed shooter, sort of suggest like violent, aggressive types of behavior. And so maybe for in that specific situation, you may find aggressive behavior more acceptable, which isn't to say that video games cause violence, because there's no evidence that they do outside of playing the actual game. So that can also work in a different way, where if you are playing a game that encourages cooperation, then you may just off the bat be more likely to cooperate. So, there's kind of, if you're a game designer, if you're a community manager who is trying to curb those kinds of toxic behaviors, then those are the kinds of things that you can think about. And so it comes to do with not only banning and silencing the troublemakers, but also like encouraging the right kinds of behavior that, or the kinds of behavior that you want, the kinds of behaviors that your players enjoy not only experiencing but doing themselves. It's not a panacea. Sometimes people are just jerks, and there's not going to be anything you can do about it outside of just removing them from the situation and banning them for violating the terms of service or community standards or whatever it is. And you can't design around that sometimes. So that's going to happen, but it's not the only tool in the box.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that the more and more we talk about is how there are these things that are related, right? So people are probably not generally as awful to each other in like an Animal Crossing game. But, if you're playing a very, aggressive shooter game, maybe people will adopt those behaviors. And then you tack on the immersion, and then you tack on the feedback loops. And then the de-individuation on top of it is kind of a negative spiral. If you hop on the spiral, it's going to take it down the staircase really fast.
Yeah, and it's interesting thing is like I think it was Riot Games doing some research for League of Legends, where they looked at like when they took a group of say 3 friends, and people who were like queued up as a trio, and they're like friends, and then did matchmaking and put them in with like 2 strangers, that there were fewer incidences of toxic behavior because those friends were friendly, because they're friends and friends are friendly with each other. And so the 2 randos that were put on that group with the 3 friends took the cues from their behavior to like have more sportsmanship, to be more polite, that kind of stuff. Not every time, it's not 100% effect, but every little bit helps, right? right?
So what are some of the positives that could come out of video games? I think there was a article that was circulating around in that doctors that played video games more frequently were more precise in their surgeries and they did it quicker, as an example. I don't know if that has been replicated or not, but there's got to be some positive upticks. It's not just negative behavior. If you have negative behavior, maybe it accentuates that, but that building or goal setting, that mastery maybe builds and improves and is a positive thing for gamers.
For sure. Yeah. I think whenever I see those types of studies or those types of reports of like, you know, doctors that played games are better surgeons, or people that play games are better at conflict management, or those kinds of things. I'm skeptical, because most of the rigorous research that I've looked at shows that playing games will make you better at playing those games. And they might improve very, very specific skills, such as being able to quickly recognize certain stimulus on a screen, or being able to tell like where a sound is coming from, the types of skills that you would need to like play a first person shooter, for example. um, and I know that game like simulations are frequently used for training of all kinds, like they have been for decades. So there's research showing that, like, yeah, if you train doctors on the simulation of doing, certain sutures or certain procedures in surgery, then they get better at doing those kinds of procedures. But I don't know if most of us would look at that and say that's a video game, like as far as I'm think about them. But the larger question of like, are there positives that come out of video games? Absolutely. I mean, just enjoying playing games is a positive, right? They bring joy to your life, they bring entertainment, they bring social connections, as we've been talking about. All of those things go in the pro column, right? They're all great. There's lots of research that's showing doing things like playing games can reduce stress and can replenish the psychological resources you need to deal with stress. So they're great what's called like de-stressors or psychological recovery activities, which if you're having a tough week at work or school, and you come home on a Thursday or a Friday and you play some games, that can help you recoup your psychological resources that you need to deal come Monday morning when you have to go back to work. Because they offer things like distraction and feelings of competence and feelings of mastery and feelings of social connection. And those are the kinds of activities that, even before they were being studied in the context of video games, researchers found helped people deal with stress. So they can do that. They can help you escape from, situations you'd rather not think about. And then that's not even taking into account that has things that have nothing to do with psychology, where people who get into video games and the video game scene pick up various skills, not through playing the games, but through deciding to pursue those skills. So game design, programming, learning to do art, learning to do music and sound, um, learning to write, doing all those sorts of things because you're a fan of the game, and maybe you want to create some fan fiction, or maybe you want to create a mod for a game, or maybe you want to create some shareable skins that people can use in the game, or maybe you want to create levels that you can upload and people can share and experience. And then those can be just hobbies that you do for fun, or they can lead to careers working in the game industry, or anything else where those sorts of skills are relevant. So I always try to remember and tell people to remember not to undervalue or forget about the fact that they playing games and being a fan of these things can be a springboard to all kinds of other skills that you may want to develop.
It's always kind of one of those things that we got to remember is that the negative things always kind of make for the big splashy headlines, but the consistently positive things can kind of get swept under the rug.
For sure, yeah.
So you mentioned that you've worked in corporate America and trying to make work suck less. What can we take from the video game world and apply it to office or work scenarios to make our work more enjoyable?
Yeah, so I wrote a whole book about that called The Engagement Game: Why Your Workplace Culture Should Look More Like a Video Game, and kind of looking at like, what do games do well and what notes can we take. And it's not always a one-to-one comparison, kind of as we talked about, But I think looking at the way that games provide feedback, as we've talked about, is a big thing that like a lot of managers could do. Looking at the way that teams operate and sort of the way that video games encourage teams of people working together to understand what other people's skills are, understand what their role are, understand what their capacity is in that particular moment, like what their bandwidth is, knowing like what skills are on cooldown, can translate to like understanding like is Sharon too busy right now, and that's called like shared mental models in psychology parlance, where you kind of understand like what everybody on your team can do, not only what their skills are, but sort of what they're capable of doing in the moment, and then what are going to be the downstream effects of what you and everybody on your team does and how it affects other people's work. Like that is something that is emphasized in the workplace a lot, especially in team oriented types of jobs where you do have to coordinate with other people. And video games like give you that information and set you up in that way to have great mental models of other players and your opponents, in ways that we could take some notes from, and we could learn how to do that better in the workplace. um, Goal setting, the types of things we talked about there, when is it right to set like a difficult goal versus a experimental goal, those kinds of things. Training and education, I think, has to do a lot with the feedback and the way that video games do that. Getting people to cooperate or compete in video games, the way that games do that through a mixture of the other topics we talked about, like goal setting and feedback, but they also provide social information about other people so you can use that information to say like, oh, I can beat that person's score. Like I can do better than they did, or I can do as well as they did. And a lot of games will give you very useful, specific social information about other people and their performance that you could sort of replicate, for example, in the workplace, where you provide information. You have like a friendly competition, like a, sales contest or customer service resolution contest or whatever it is. And you give information to the people participating that allows them to tell if they're doing well or not. I mean, that's like hypothesized to be one of the reasons why leaderboards work, is that you see yourself on a leaderboard and you see like, wow, like Tony is, 2 steps ahead of me. I know I'm better than Tony. So I know that like if I just focus for a little bit, I can beat his score. I can take over his spot on the leaderboard. And you got to be careful with that sort of stuff, that it doesn't backfire. There's consequences in real life workplaces that aren't present in video games. So, you want to apply some common sense and basic things there. There's examples on like how to develop organizational culture, because we can look at not so much video games, but like video game fandom and even game development companies themselves, for how they go about creating a culture for fandom and for play and valuing the kinds of things that they value. And they're doing the same things to create that culture that we would do to create a culture of, say, safety or respect or um, accountability, in a workplace. And you can do the same sorts of things. And the amazing thing is that this is all drawing from, or my observations here, whether I'm talking about video games or the workplace, are drawing from the same psychological theories and research. Like it's the same human nature on display. It's just a different context. It's just a different place. And so it's easy, in a lot of cases, it's easy to apply those lessons from one place to another.
Now you got to have a couple hypotheses. What's the plural for hypothesis?
Hypotheses.
Hypotheses. Um, you got to have a few of those that you think could work in a office or corporate environment. Do you have any pet ideas that you think would be effective at changing the game?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes from like gamification efforts. So gamification is taking game-like elements and applying them to non-game activities like work, shopping, engagement in the political process, education, those types of things, and trying to make that feel like a game. And a lot of times it comes down to like, let's add points, badges, and leaderboards, and that's gamification. I think people have become more sophisticated than that in the last few years, which is great because I'm interested in like, well, how do we do things like feedback in a gamification system? How do we do things like the endowed progress effect, like with the punch cards, and how do we like manipulate that? Um, there's yeah, lots of ideas out there for, you know, people experimenting in this area, or like graduate students needing a dissertation idea. Um, I try to drop those in, but it's yeah, let's look beyond points, badges, and leaderboards, and let's look at like social comparisons, for example. What effect does providing different social information have on people's behavior in the workplace, or shopping, consumerism, or in the classroom, those kinds of things as well. So those, yeah, I'm not sure I have anything specific off the top of my head beyond that, but there's lots of opportunities.
We got to give you a company to tinker with, and
Sure.
let you play around.
I don't know if you want to give me that much responsibility, but sure, I won't say no.
So before I send you off, I guess I got a couple last questions here. Is that when you started playing video games, it was that arcade, put in the quarter, maybe a couple buttons and a joystick. Now we are very advanced next gen consoles, high grade PCs. Where do you see gaming heading in the next 10 to 20 years? And do you think that's going to unlock some psychological tendencies that we've never seen before with gamers?
I'm not sure anything truly fundamental is going to change, because it's still, and there's still games, and the definition of a game is not going to wildly change that much. But on the other hand, we have lived through some revolutions, with I, IT and the internet, making games more social and more connected in some ways. I At one point I might have said virtual reality is going to be the next big sea change, where it's going to change things like immersion and connection and so forth. But it kind of doesn't seem like that, like VR penetration into the market has happened as much as some people were saying it was going to happen or hoping it was going to happen. So if it does, like that sort of stuff, or if we get like, wearable, affordable, comfortable, usable technology, makes a breakthrough, that could really bring VR back into the picture, and make things much more immersive and allow us to interact with games in ways that we hadn't before through hand gestures instead of using controllers. And you see some of that now. It's out there. It's just not as revolutionary or as widespread as you might want it to be. Seems like I can't respond to this question without mentioning AI, right? I'm not bullish on AI for things like making games. I don't think it's going to. There will be tools that allow you to do things, and there have been middleware things like here's how to, use technology to do things, automate things that used to have been much more labor intensive before. AI could be interesting in that maybe games could use it to make bespoke gaming experiences, like which subquest is going to be more motivating, for a player, or based on their behavior, which NPC, are they going to be more interested in talking to, or how should that NPC react? And so, like, AI advances could help sort of determine that. But I think that you're always going to have the best products when it's humans creating the content, and AI is just like a tool that helps deliver the content, for example.
So, last question I have for you is just trying to put like a bow on this conversation today. Do you think that video games exhibit unique human psychology tendencies, or does it just rehash our pre existing tendencies in a digital environment?
Probably more the latter, which goes back to the point that I was making, that a lot of the research on the psychology of games and other fields too, like communication theory in games, relies and makes very good use of existing theories and research, right? And you can just take those things and apply them to human behavior in video games. It's the same humans, it's the same brains, it's the same social instincts that are occurring in both places. I think that video games frequently create like a petri dish or a laboratory that makes it a lot easier to study that kind of stuff in ways that you couldn't before. And there may be some things that are specific to video games, but even then, I think you have broader contexts like computer mediated communication, where you're communicating with another person through a computer, and the same sorts of theories that would apply whether you're talking about doing it in a video game or Discord or a message board can be equally fruitfully applied, to any of those kinds of contexts. So yeah, my assertion all along is that like there's plenty to mine from existing psychology research and theory to understanding games, or to understanding games. I think the specific questions that we want to answer will change, because we'll want to answer questions about how people behave when they play games, or how games affect people, or those kinds of things. But the I think the psychological mechanisms are underlying it all, are going to be pretty consistent. Prove me wrong, though, researchers, and then send me a link to your to your findings.
Dr. Madigan, I appreciate your research here. And why don't you tell people where they can find your books, where they can find you on socials and online?
So probably the one-stop place to go is psychologyofgames.com, because that is the blog and the podcast that I have that goes along for all this. There's like literally hundreds of articles that are there free for anybody to read, and episodes of the podcast that are free to go to. And in the podcast, I typically interview researchers or people working in the gaming industry who are applying psychology to their work. So it's usually interesting conversations. There's links there to my books, Getting Gamers, the psychology of video games and their impact on the people who play them, is sort of the one that has had the longest tail, and that especially gamers will be most interested in. And then most recently, I published The Psychology of Dungeons and Dragons, which does the same thing for tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and sort of looks at like what psychology has to say about why we enjoy playing D&D, and why we behave as we do when we play, and what benefits we get out of it, and so forth. So you can also go to Psychology of D&D, like that's D, the letter N, the letter D, .com, to find out about that and some blog articles related. And then I'm on Blue Sky. What is my handle on Blue Sky? I always forget. I think it's like Jamie.Madigan. But you can find links. JamieMadigan.bluesky.social. But you can find links there along with everything else at psychologyofgames.com.
Awesome. Thank you much. I appreciate your work.
Yeah, it's been a fun conversation. Thanks for having me on.